The MacNeil NewsHour is brought to you locally by SIT Mutual Fund Group, pure no-load mutual funds managed by Twin Cities-based SIT Investment Associates. Lyman Lumber Company, the professional builder's supply center, serving the Twin Cities from Chanhassen. The law firm of Gray, Plant, Moody & Bennett, a professional association where results are a tradition. And by Little Six Incorporated, proudly owned and operated by the Shakopee, Mdewakanton, Dakota community.
Good evening, I'm Jim Lehrer in Washington.
And I'm Elizabeth Farnsworth in New York. After our summary of the news this Thursday, we begin with an update on Japan's deadly earthquake. Then, the House Republican effort to get tough on crime. Next, extended excerpts from today's hearings on funding for public broadcasting. And finally, a report from Oregon on jobs and the environment.
Funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour has been provided by the Archer Daniels Midland Company. With ADM ingredients in thousands of consumer products, it's no wonder ADM is called Supermarket to the World. And by New York Life, yet another example of the wise investment philosophy New York Life has been following for the last 150 years, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
More than 4,000 people have now been killed and nearly 22,000 injured by the earthquake near Kobe, Japan. It's the country's worst natural disaster in more than 70 years. Rescue workers and search dogs are working round the clock in an attempt to find some of the 700 people still missing. But with 30,000 buildings badly damaged or destroyed, the death toll is likely to rise. Aftershocks and power surges have set off new fires, complicating rescue efforts. Most of the city is still without electricity or water, and about 270,000 people are crammed into several hundred makeshift shelters. We'll have more on this story after the news summary. In northern India, at least 125 people have been killed by an avalanche in the Himalayan mountains. Searches are underway for several hundred people who are still missing. Jim?
The squabble over Speaker Newt Gingrich's book deal continued today. Yesterday, Congresswoman Carrie Meek, Democrat of Florida, took to the House floor to question the amount of money Gingrich might make. Republicans had her words stricken from the record, leading to Democratic charges of censorship. The Democratic Minority Whip, David Bonnier, had this to say today.
We are being told that the Speaker is being placed above criticism and comment.
The gentleman is incorrect in drawing that conclusion.
The issue that we have before us is basically closing down voices. The record of this House is being changed arbitrarily. Committee meetings are being shut down prematurely. Private meetings on major policy issues are being held outside this institution. Members are being gagged on the House floor. The question I have, Mr. Speaker, is this going to be the policy of the new majority in the 104th Congress?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Reporters asked Gingrich about the criticism. He cited conservative columnist Robert Novak's charge in today's Washington Post that House Democrats are out to destroy Gingrich.
Yeah, I think you need to read the Novak column in its entirety and reflect on it. Because the point of the column is that while the book is a detail in this fight, that there is a small group of people so bitter about losing control of the House that they have decided that any device which destroys me is legitimate.
The House did begin debate today on unfunded mandates. Those are laws which Congress requires the states to enforce without giving them money to do so. A bill restricting them is expected to pass the House as early as next week. In the Senate, Democrats have resisted Republican efforts to end debate on the issue and bring it to a vote. A Republican attempt to put a time limit on the debate failed today by 6 votes.
In economic news, the Commerce Department reported the nation's trade deficit grew more than 4% in November to more than $10.5 billion. A surge in oil and other imports contributed to the rise. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones average dropped nearly 47 points in heavy trading. 18 Cubans reached Miami this morning aboard a small boat. They are the first refugees to arrive since an exodus of Cuban boat people last summer. Cuba and the United States reached an agreement in September to curb the flow.
Chechnya's rebels lost their battle for the presidential palace today. Russian forces seized the building and raised Russia's flag. Russia's President Yeltsin declared the military operation effectively over. Paul Davis of Independent Television News has more from Grozny.
For 6 weeks, the presidential palace has been the symbol of Chechen resistance. Today, the fighters admitted they've been forced to abandon the battered building. An ITN camera witnessed the last 24 hours of the assault that broke Chechen resistance. As Russian bombers dropped chaff to confuse ground-based missiles before diving to add rockets and bombs to the artillery shells already raining on Chechen positions. Under such a bombardment, the Chechen fighters were forced to pull back and give up their palace. In his underground bunker, the chief of Chechen military police said it was not surrender, but a strategic decision to withdraw from the palace. But even as he was talking, the Russians were bringing up more reinforcements to capitalize on their breakthrough. These are Spetsnaz, special forces trained for street fighting. In Grozny now, those civilians who can are leaving. Those with nowhere to go are becoming increasingly desperate. Scuffles breaking out as mostly elderly men and women queued for bread sent in from neighboring Dagestan. Again, it is the civilians who are paying the price. Seconds before we arrived here, a shell had hit the road, seemingly killing 7 people. But rescuers noticed that 2 were still alive. They warned us this neighborhood was now being targeted. This is a civilian area on the outskirts of the city. These people were civilians trying to flee the fighting. The blast from another shell blew 2 of us off the road. Shrapnel hit our vehicle, but we were unharmed. The Chechens said at least 7 people on the road had not been so fortunate.
That concludes our summary of today's news. Now it's on to an update on the Japanese earthquake, the Republican approach to crime, funding for public broadcasting, and Oregon's economic boom.
That deadly earthquake in Japan is our lead again tonight. Liz Donnelly of Independent Television News has an update report from the port city of Kobe.
This morning at first light, it was impossible to detect the trauma which has hit the city of Kobe, once renowned for its style and its beauty. Now, down in the city centre, there's still a sense of disbelief as people wander around gazing at the devastation, even now not really able to absorb its scale or the size of the reconstruction job ahead. On the surface, people seem calm, perhaps in shock, but hazards are everywhere. Fires are proving the most immediate. This was one of 90 caused by gas explosions, fueled by dry debris and whipped up by icy winds. Astonishingly, for this sophisticated nation, we didn't see a single fireman equipped with breathing apparatus. The men were left with just the protection of fireproof scarves. It's also hard to fathom why, here in one of the most developed parts of the world, firemen are slowed down because the water supply's been cut off, and they have to pump up supplies from the rivers below. The injured are still being brought to hospital, many with critical wounds. Inside, the scene is reminiscent of a Third World War zone. The wards are desperately overstretched. There are nothing like enough beds to go round. This is the Higashi Kobe Hospital. It's only midday, and already 600 new patients have arrived. Water and food, says the chief administrator, those are the real essentials, and we are desperately short. Doctors rush to examine Kimio Osatani, who's just arrived after being trapped beneath rubble since Tuesday. They had hoped to evacuate the serious cases to other hospitals with more facilities, but today the demand was just too much, and people like Kimio had to stay here. Katsuhiro Fukushima lay quietly, aware he was lucky to be alive after his third-floor flat collapsed, trapping him inside.
I was kicking to attract attention. However, people had great difficulty in pulling me out, although they tried again and again. Then, I think it was around noon yesterday, at long last, they arrived to get me out. So many times I thought I would die. It was such a long time. People outside said, "We will come back. We promise you we'll come back to get you out." It was such a long time until they did that. I was wondering what was happening to them.
More than 21,000 buildings have been destroyed or badly damaged, the majority older wooden structures like this one. This morning, Megumi Hamada and her family came to try and salvage as much as they could from the rubble, which had once been their home. Megumi had been cooking on the ground floor when the earthquake struck, and her house collapsed on top of her. Her children, who escaped from the floor above, tried to help her, but found her leg trapped by a beam. Eventually, though, they did bring her out. Today, there were no tears from Megumi or anyone else in the family, though they've all lost so much. Instead, a calm acceptance astonishing to anyone from the West.
It's not only me suffering from this earthquake, everybody is suffering, so I'm trying to be optimistic about life. The first thing I have to do is just to get out of this place and find a new place to live. After I sort myself out, I can bring my family back together.
While Megumi was trying to recover her possessions, civil defense workers arrived to see if someone else might be buried beneath the house. Across the road, they were trying to discover what had happened to the family who once lived here. One neighbor told them he thought a woman had been killed, but had no idea whether her husband and son were with her. The problems faced by the civil defense with no heat-detecting equipment are overwhelming. In the 2 hours we spent watching them, they found nothing with their spades or bare hands, and by the time we left, heavy lifting equipment had arrived, but the crane operator said he was standing by, waiting for further orders. This area, known as Nada-ku, is amongst the most wrecked in Kobe. What on Monday were smart streets in a middle-class district now resemble scenes from a full-scale war. It's almost impossible to believe that until 3 days ago, this devastated area was home to 100 families. But fire broke out in the newsagents, which was here, and it spread so quickly that many of those who'd survived the earthquake were burnt to death. As darkness fell, the streets were scattered with small groups, huddled together trying to keep out the bitter cold. Nearly 72 hours after the earthquake, in this, the world's most technologically developed country, like Toshiyonishi, more than 10% of the population here are homeless. Hundreds of thousands more have little food and no water, electricity or gas. The outside world may be inclined to judge Japan for failing to be adequately prepared, but this natural disaster was on such a scale, it's doubtful any amount of advanced work would have prevented great suffering.
Still to come on the NewsHour tonight, a new debate about crime, the public broadcasting hearings, and job growth in Oregon.
Situation in Japan. The search for survivors in the earthquake-stricken city of Kobe is winding down, but the search for ways to avoid a similar disaster elsewhere in the country is just beginning. Liz Donnelly of Independent Television News reports.
It wasn't the earthquake that killed Yukiko Terauchi, a young woman who'd recently left home to move into her own flat in Kobe. She, together with several hundred others who lived here in Higashi Nadaku, was a tragic casualty of the relief effort. When the authorities switched electricity back on without checking for gas leaks, this whole area went straight up in flames. Firemen gently helped Yukiko's shocked father place her remains in a polythene bag, watched by her brother and his friend. After all the horror of the earthquake, this was still a shocking scene. But amazingly, many other areas have suffered a similar fate, and countless other people have died through mistakes or lack of action. People here believed Japanese technology would protect them from natural disaster. This is one of the very few occasions we witness people trying to relax. Toshio Matsumoto was on the night shift in his job at the water board when the earthquake happened. He came here to help his parents in a shelter after their flat became too unstable to live in.
In the quake, wardrobes and furniture fell down. So in future, I want to see them fixed to the walls.
I want buildings to be far more solid in the future. Up till now, the priority in council housing has been to build quickly. So the work has been very shoddy.
No one anticipated craters in the landscape and the destruction of the infrastructure. 10 years ago, regulations were introduced designed to give new buildings enough support to withstand a force 6 earthquake. At over 7, the Kobe quake was too strong. For the moment, the immediate emergency is paramount, with new fires every day and the remains of thousands of buildings still to be searched for survivors. Kobe City Council says it has a basic master plan for the future, but no one there's yet ready to discuss it. It was the newly built modern skyscrapers which fared best in the Kobe earthquake, and the traditional 2-story Japanese buildings with heavy tiled roofs supported by wooden beams, which took a heavy toll. But modern blocks were badly damaged too, often because inside they lacked enough supporting walls. Ideally, each building should have the support of cross-bracing like this, but planners will have to decide in future how much they're willing to spend.
For the following 2 or 3 years, they may take that decision that their building must be strong enough to stand decision. But after, say, so-called 10 years or so, people may forget. This is the nature of human being. After the event, everybody understands the meaning of disaster.
This is Kobe, and this is Osaka, and this is Awajishima.
400 miles away in Tokyo, scientists here at the Earthquake Research Institute are monitoring the aftershocks in the area around Kobe. They also keep a close eye on earth movements in the rest of the country. Tokyo is considered far more vulnerable to earthquakes than Kobe was. In the last 15 years, scientists here say there have been an average of 20 quakes a year. The largest, between 4 and 5 on the Richter scale, was 8 years ago. But at any moment, they say, a quake as large as the one in Kobe could occur. In the capital, people are going about their normal everyday lives, indulging in their nation's passion for golf. But they say they've been deeply disturbed by Kobe's experience and the lack of effective government response.
I'm so ashamed of my government. They pay lip service only. Meeting, meeting, meeting. They should take action instead of meeting.
It's now clear I must know how to react in an earthquake. A rucksack, water and emergency rations should be kept. Everything's selling out. I could only find a rucksack.
In department stores, earthquake survival kits are selling like hotcakes. Customers aware that a recent report estimated an earthquake like Kobe's here could have a horrifying 860,000 casualties if it hit in the rush hour. In Kobe, it'll be a very long time before all those who lost their homes once again have a house of their own. But the hope now is that new generations will benefit from the lessons learned, and that never again will this country be as unprepared.
Finally tonight, essayist Phyllis Thoreau considers the pros and cons of staying inside.
Once upon a time, everything was outside.
Locally funded recreation programs it would like to expand with federal dollars. But like the prison funding, little of the money authorized for prevention has actually been appropriated. Some state officials think the new Congress may never appropriate it. William Woodward is the director of the Criminal Justice Division of the State Patrol. He's crunched the numbers on the total amount Colorado might eventually receive from the crime bill.
I think in worst case we might get something under $500,000 because that's really all that has been appropriated. for this year. There are no appropriations for future years. If the maximum amount that's authorized into the future would actually show up in the future, then I think Colorado could get close to $60 million.
How likely is that to be authorized?
I would be willing to bet you it would never happen.
That may very well be a correct assumption. At a hearing today in Washington, House Republicans outlined what they call the Take Back Our Streets Act. Among other things, it would rewrite many of the provisions of the compromise crime bill Congress passed last summer. Specifically, it would eliminate the money earmarked for prevention programs, add money for prison construction, and toughen up the sentencing guidelines.
As I see it, H.R. 3 accomplishes 4 important goals. First, it makes a major move to put deterrence back into our criminal justice system. We badly need to send the message, when you do the crime, you do the time. Second, H.R. 3 gets the federal government out of the way of state and local law enforcement, the front lines of the war against crime. It does this by curtailing endless appeals by state death row inmates who currently use federal law to delay justice for years and years. It restricts the ability of federal judges to seize control of local jails and state prisons as a result of lawsuits filed by prisoners. And it repeals dozens of federal grant programs that represent a Washington knows best approach to public safety. Third, H.R. 3 accomplishes the goal of assisting state and local governments in the fight against crime where such assistance is most needed. The bill calls for $10 billion in block grants to units of local government for the purpose of reducing crime and improving public safety. Local governments are free to use these funds in whatever manner they choose, including the hiring of more police and crime prevention. The bill also authorizes more than $10 billion for building, expanding, or operating state prisons. Finally, H.R. 3 addresses the continuing problem of criminal alien deportation by strengthening procedures for deporting such criminals and freeing up desperately needed funds for state prison beds. I believe the bill fundamentally addresses many of the concerns and fears about violent crime in America.
I would say, Mr. Chairman, you have an impossible job. And that job is to convince America that Congress should turn around and go backward, not march forward and solve new problems. Very simply put, this bill plows over old ground. It digs up old causes. It will tie up the House for weeks, Mr. Chairman, and it will do so needlessly. Because America already has a good, tough, balanced crime bill. You can't stop crime with just cops. You can't stop crime with just prisons. And you can't stop crime with just prevention. You need a tough, smart balance in all of those, and that's what our bill gave America. This bill destroys that balance. It wipes out the prevention programs that will keep millions of kids from ever picking up their first gun or ever using their first drug or joining their first gang. It tears up the contract that this Congress made last year with the American people to put 100,000 new cops on the beat. And it replaces the solid promises of our crime bill trust fund with a block grant program that's as slippery as an eel. That block grant program promises everything to everyone, but in the end, it delivers absolutely nothing to anybody.
We hear a sample of the crime debate now from 2 members of Congress from the Colorado delegation. They are Democrat Pat Schroeder and Republican Scott McGinnis. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Congressman McGinnis, to you first. Why do we need a new crime bill? And specifically, what in your Colorado district leads you to want a new and different bill?
Well, remember that, excuse me, one size doesn't fit all. And I think that crime in America and the resolution of crime in America is best dictated at the local level and not by the people in Washington, D.C. As you saw from the previous clip that you've had on the show this evening, while there may have been good intent with last year's crime bill, the fact is very few of those dollars are actually being delivered. And then when they are delivered, as in the Denver situation, there are lots of strings attached. I think the block grant bill is the answer. You send block grants to the local communities and let the local communities determine what's best for them. You know what may be best for a district in Washington, D.C. or a downtown New York City is a whole lot different than what might be best in the ranching community of Meeker, Colorado, or in the resort community of Glenwood Springs, Colorado. So I think the block grant makes a whole lot more sense, and we can deliver, which is something that this last bill has not done.
Congresswoman Schroeder, what's wrong with that?
Well, first of all, I think the block grant is a joke. No one's ever going to see any money in the block grant. They cut it down by $2.5 billion, and no money kicks in until all prisons are fully funded. I don't think there's any way in the world we'll live that long. And secondly, it puts police and prevention programs in together. And what a community could do is fund all their current police out of this and then give people tax rebates. That's not what we intended to do. We intended to help communities with an add-on. I think another piece is it really basically kills prevention. I think we just know it kills prevention. And one of the things in Denver that we did so well was we put together this project PAC of the federal government, the state government, and all the local communities sitting around the table together. And the Justice Department got them lots of revenues that were very similar to what would have come out of the crime bill had we not tampered with it. And we had a summer of safety where for the first time our crime rate came down. And I want to tell you, people in Colorado are sold that prevention really works. You keep kids busy and they stay out of trouble. And that's exactly what we want to have happen. And now we're never going to ever get a chance for this to work for other communities. But we were so fortunate to at least have shown it worked.
Well, Congressman McGinnis, it looks a little bit like we're reliving the battle over sort of between prevention and punishment from last year. Why do we have to do that?
Oh, I don't think we are. I think the difference, excuse me, is the difference between prevention and hug-a-thug programs. You know, midnight basketball doesn't have a lot to do or a lot to help prevention of crime in Meeker, Colorado. The DARE program does. What the Republican
I'm sorry, the what program?
The DARE program, which is a program in the elementary and junior high schools. What this program by block grant is, it allows a community like Meeker to go ahead with their DARE program and not be dictated by Washington, D.C. It does keep in the prevention programs, but it does get rid of some programs that I call the hug-a-thug or pat them on the back and tell them to behave programs like midnight basketball. Now, if somebody in New York City determines that that type of program, and I have yet to be convinced that it works, but somebody in New York City thinks it works best for that city, they have the option under our bill to exercise that. So we got to make a clear distinction between prevention and social programs. Yes, we're tough on those social programs like midnight basketball, but no, we are not cutting out prevention. Prevention makes a lot of sense. I used to be a cop. I know it makes sense, and we are protecting prevention, but we're keeping it at the local level.
Let me respond to that, because let me try one more time. I must not have been clear. Number one, prevention really is dead, because in this new block grant is both police money and prevention money. The whole thing is lowered by $2.5 billion from what it was before, and you never see one dime from that whole block grant unless they fully fund all the prisons. Now, I just don't think that's realistically going to happen, even in our state, where we're not complying anywhere near. We're only getting, people are only serving 50% of the time, and we haven't been able to build prisons fast enough. So I'm not sure we'll ever get to that level. So what we're really saying is we're dangling something out in front of communities, but guess what? It's not really there. It's not going to be reachable. And I think that's the difference. Secondly, let me say, in last year's crime bill, it was also a block grant for prevention. There was a community policing grant and a block grant for prevention. And the prevention grant didn't say Meeker had to have midnight basketball. It listed a whole range of prevention-type programs, such as DARE, which Congressman McGinnis likes, such as midnight basketball, such as any number of things that the community could use that money for. It put a parameter around it, but it had to be for prevention programs that had been tested in different communities and worked.
Congressman McGinnis, what's your response to that?
Well, you know, frankly, I think some of the allegations coming that way are hogwash. This last bill, the crime bill of '94, has not delivered. In your own piece this evening, you heard from the chief of police in Denver who talks about the strings attached. You heard from an expert with the Colorado State Patrol that said maybe Colorado will get 500,000. They could have 60 million, but what are the chances of that ever occurring? Almost non-existent. We can deliver this product. Sure, it's $2.5 billion less than last year's because, frankly, there is a lot of waste that was contained in last year's programs through some of the hug-a-thugs, through some of these other programs that don't make sense. I think we have to be realistic. We have to be able to deliver the product, and the bill that we're proposing does that. And I might add, the testimony given today by the administration points out very clearly there are a lot of parts of this bill, like the exclusionary section on it, like restitution being ordered upon the defendant, that make sense in this bill. So we've got, across the aisle, bipartisan support, and it can work. And Representative Schroeder, you need to get on board because of the fact that it can work.
Let
you
me
can
just
help make
say,
it work.
I sat in the hearings, and I think I know very much about what's in both of these bills, having lived through both of them. The reason that last year's bill hasn't taken effect yet is we paid for it out of the downsizing of the federal government with a trust fund. And that's how we agreed to do it, rather than because we're trying to get the debt down. Now, I think if you go back and listen to what the police chief said, he said he was very happy to have those police, and yes, they have to contribute 25%. But let me tell you something, it was an incentive to get them out there in community policing, which my community likes, and they did it. And the comments made about will we get funding in the future, I think they're absolutely right. No, we won't, because this new block grant is a gimmick. It's a joke in which you put everything together and tied it to prisons, and it sinks the whole thing. So it really looks like something, but it really isn't. And I think that everybody ought to be perfectly aware that that's what we're doing. We're blowing up the prevention programs, and every police chief, everybody that has testified in front of our committee says, we need prevention programs. Prisons are driving everything so hard, they never get an extra dime for prevention. And we know prevention works. The state of California just put a new study out that was in Time magazine showing that if you looked at 3 strikes and you're out, and they've been implementing that in their state, versus prevention, they found prevention was much more effective. And I just wish we'd start looking at the hard facts rather than dealing with our glands.
Okay, I want to move on now to some specifics of the Republican bill. Congressman McGinnis, let's start with the mandatory minimum sentencing for drug crimes or violent crimes that involve possession of a gun. The sentence, the mandatory minimum would be 10 years.
Yes.
Why is it necessary?
Well, what happened in last year's bill is that the administration went after possession of a firearm and not misuse of a firearm. I used to be a police officer, and I can tell you that the difficulties that I dealt with, that people reported in, were not as a result of law-abiding citizens. It was a result of people who disregard the law. What our bill does is it says, hey, we're going to go not after possession of a firearm, we're going to go after misuse of a firearm. And if you use a firearm, if you carry it in, if you use it in the commission of a crime, if you discharge it, you're going to get an automatic penalty. That's how you impact the misuse of weapons in this country, not by taking away Second Amendment rights or by restricting a person's right to protect themselves with a firearm.
Okay, Congresswoman Schroeder, what do you think about that?
Well, obviously, I am for much stronger penalties for anyone who uses weapons. I think that that really changes the whole scenario, and people can't defend against that. So I obviously am for anything that increases that. One of the big fears I have about this crime bill is whether somebody decides to start attaching amendments to it to undo the assault weapon ban or to undo the Brady bill. All of that would be germane, and all of that would be possible. And I think that would mean we're going in the wrong direction.
Okay, back to you, Congressman McGinnis, on the exclusionary rule.
Yes.
The good faith exemption.
Yes.
Would you explain what it is, why you think it's necessary?
Okay, very simply, what the exclusionary rule says is that if an officer is found not to have probable cause when he stops a car, for example, any evidence that he gathers or secures as a result of that can be thrown out by the court. For example, the case that is well known is the case with a Pennsylvania car that was stopped in another state because they did not have a license plate on the front of the car. Technically, in Pennsylvania, you only have to have one license plate on your car. So the officer was improper on his stop of this car. But while he stopped the car, he observed in the back seat over 200 pounds of cocaine. The court threw out the evidence of the cocaine because the person driving the car was legal with one plate. What the exclusionary rule says with a good faith exception is, hey, court, you may go ahead and admonish the officer for improperly stopping the car, but don't punish society by throwing out the criminal evidence of the drugs. And I think that certainly the administration's testimony today supported that. I would expect that Pat Schroeder would support it, and I certainly support that good faith exception. And by the way, we do have that in place in the state of Colorado, and it works very, very well.
Do you support it, Ms. Schroeder?
Well, the administration does support it in that form. I think we want to be a little bit careful, and I think that's what they're saying too. You don't want to start violating the illegal search and seizure that we're all protected from in the Bill of Rights. Obviously, you don't want to have the penalties so lessened that people can suddenly break into your home or break into your computers or break into your telephone lines or your car or anything else. And so we've got to find a balance so that it is tough enough that people will still make every effort to make sure it is a proper search and seizure, or you'll have citizens screaming just as loud on the other side.
And Congressman McGinnis, very briefly on the deportation of criminal aliens, why is this in the bill? And then I'd like to hear Congresswoman Schroeder's response too.
Well, there's some difficulty in deporting people who cause difficulties in this country, who may not be citizens of this country. And I think that that needs to be looked at more on a case-to-case basis. I will say that in this bill this year, it is the first time in this criminal debate that that issue has really been brought to the forefront and brought up to the House floor for an open debate. So I look forward to that, and I also look forward to seeing what kind of amendments are going to be made on that. But when you read the bill and the difficulties we have in dealing with international treaties and so on, we need to improve that gap, because it's an opening that's allowing some people to walk away from the crimes and the punishment they deserve.
Okay, very briefly, Congresswoman.
Well, obviously we're going to discuss it. We're going to have to look at it. It's like that's the new fad this year. We've got to look for illegal aliens everywhere. They're causing everything. I think we have to look at it case by case. I think that we can't just draw any broad brush, or we'll end up making the same mistakes we made it when we were too lax before.
Well, thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Now the issue of federal funding for public broadcasting. It was the subject of a House Appropriations Subcommittee hearing today. Kwame Holman reports.
Judging from the comments of most of the members of Congress at today's hearing, continued funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting wouldn't be in question if these were times of fiscal abundance. But as Subcommittee Chairman John Porter pointed out, these are not the best of times.
We must get our deficits and our debt under control so that we do not continue to pass along a crushing debt burden to our children and grandchildren. Let everyone understand that there are no easy choices in our bill. We must choose among programs that educate our children, serve the health of the American people, and protect and train our country's workers. In effect, we must ask, is public broadcasting a higher priority than Pell Grants, Head Start, the vaccine program, or worker retraining? Given the change in leadership in the House, we intend to examine every aspect of our budget.
Porter described himself as a supporter of the public broadcasting system and National Public Radio, both of which receive about 14% of their funding from CPB. Democrat David Obey said he too was a supporter and measured the $285 million CPB gets from the government against other federal spending.
We spend $300 million a week on highway assistance. We spend $1 billion apiece for B-2 bombers, 3 times as much as is appropriated for this program. We spend $3 billion for new aircraft carriers. And so I would submit that we ought to ask the same questions about all programs when we're searching for ways to cut the federal budget.
Defending CPB at today's hearing was Corporation President Richard Carlson and Board Chairman Henry Coffin, who also heads South Carolina Public Television. Both were asked how PBS might survive if federal funding were reduced or even eliminated.
The federal government's funds make up about 14% of the total amount of money spent on public broadcasting in this country every year. The budget for all public radio and television is about $1.8 billion. And the 86% that was discussed this morning up here comes from states, it comes from local governments, it comes from cities in licensing, it comes from corporations, and it comes from about 5 million Americans who contribute out of their pocket to their local radio and television stations. The federal contribution enables those local stations to raise money from those other sources. And to many stations, federal funds really make the crucial difference between whether they survive or whether they fail.
It's the local stations in your own communities that you're talking about.
You're not talking about what has been described as bloated bureaucracies in Washington. You're talking about what is going to happen to your own local community stations. And in my view, many of them are going to go off the air, and others will be tragically damaged if funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is zeroed out.
What kind of contingency plans do you have to move towards, say, a 5-year game plan to, cut that cord to the federal government of federal funding? Because you're not going to go out of existence. Now, maybe some small stations are going to go out of existence, but they're going to still get it through the satellite or through the new telephone companies going to the services. What would your plan be over a 5-year period?
I can't give you the specifics, Mr. Miller, but we are working on such a plan. And I think you framed the question. I had said this earlier about the survival of public broadcasting perfectly right. It is a question as to whether this is worth it to the elected representatives of the American people, the federal participation, I mean.
Louisiana's Bob Livingston, chairman of the full Appropriations Committee, said he was concerned that some local public stations have used their airtime recently to lobby for continued federal funding.
In the last 6 or 8 days, across the screen under Big Bird and Barney and all of the other wonderful programs on my local public broadcasting station, there's a tagline that says something to the effect, this program could go out of business, and if you don't want it to go out of business, if you want to save Big Bird, please call Bob Livingston at 202-225-3015 or at his local office at 504-589-2753 and let him know. I'm not sure, but I think a lawyer would take a look at what's happening and suggest that perhaps the law is being violated. Now, is that an adequate or proper expenditure of taxpayers' funds?
We have no control over that. As to the legality of it, if they don't use federal funds to do so, and we certainly have stated clearly that they cannot use federal funds to do so, then I would hesitate to make a judgment as to the legality of it.
I'm pleased to hear that the chairman was pursuing the point about lobbying, because I'm relieved to know that I'll no longer be called by representatives of the defense industry and the rest who profit so much from the largesse of the American taxpayer. And I think it will be news to them that they're not supposed to be, in light of the fungibility of money, using any of that on their lobbying efforts.
California's Nancy Pelosi said she supported continued federal funding for CPB. So did Nita Lowey of New York, who brought along 2 witnesses who she said were not called to testify.
Make no mistake about it, Mr. Chairman, this debate is about Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch and Barney and Kermit. And the new Republican majority has put them on the chopping block.
But Henry Bonilla of Texas wasn't to be outdone. He displayed a picture of Barney, PBS's popular purple dinosaur, and asked why PBS couldn't benefit from Barney's marketing success.
Barney has been an enormous success on public broadcasting, and that means it has brought a lot of money into public broadcasting. The 2 points. We are reducing our financial commitment to Barney because of its profitability, and ultimately in the next year or 2 that is erased. All of the funds will be recouped, and of course Barney raises millions of dollars through its success to be used in other public television shows, including a new one for kids called Wishbone, which is being done by the Barney producers, and it is an educational show. They're not entertainment shows per se. They employ educators and experts and so on to determine the storylines and the plot lines, and they benefit kids in a lot of ways that none of the cable shows do.
Several members of Congress asked to testify for and against continued federal funding for CPB.
Taking the federal funds out of this picture would not cause most of these stations to shut down, unless, of course, their product is totally out of sync with the tastes and the values and the desires of the American people who they are supposed to serve.
Now, if you want to put this incredible resource that we have, if we were going to have a plan, in fact, to ensure that every American child would have access to high-quality information, this would be the plan. $1 per person per year. Have one channel dedicated to getting high-quality information into the minds of every child, that every mother, regardless of income, could have access to.
This afternoon, opponents of federal funding of public broadcasting came before the committee to argue that the government should get out of the broadcasting business and leave it to private companies. They were followed by a pro-CPB group who countered that the private sector would never provide the kind of programming available on public broadcasting. Several Democrats complained when they weren't allowed to question the panels, and the subcommittee adjourned, having reached no decision on CPB funding.
The public broadcasting funding issue goes to the full House Appropriations Committee next month.
Next, the economic boom in Oregon, where a bitter feud over spotted owls between the logging industry and the federal government ended finally with a court victory for the government. Lee Hochberg of Oregon Public Broadcasting reports on what's happened since.
Okay, and what you want to do is just go up to File and Open.
Yeah. Got it.
For 21 years, Mike McAnulty ran machines and measured logs in an Oregon lumber mill.
Okay, under File Names, go ahead and highlight that. That should be your DOS database.
Today, he's more likely to see big trees on his computer screen than out in the woods. McAnulty was laid off from his mill job 2 years ago and has retrained himself for a job in technical support at a Eugene, Oregon software manufacturer.
I very much appreciate your help.
All right, Horace.
Thank you.
Should bring it right in with no problem.
Thank you, sir.
You bet.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I never thought I would ever be making a living talking on the phone. You didn't talk in the mail because it was noisy. You screamed once in a while if you wanted to communicate, but it wasn't like you had, you know, conversations much.
McAnulty could be a poster boy for the evolving Oregon economy, an economy based more on downloading software than downing trees. He's made the difficult transition to the information economy.
It was hard to go out and look for that first job. I sweat blood. I had no interviewing experience. I was nervous. Sweat. Head in the face, just sweating and stammering. I'm proof. I'm proof that you can do something different if you want to, or if you're forced to.
It was only 5 years ago that timber workers halted traffic on Interstate 5 in the Northwest to protest cuts in the federally mandated timber harvest. They said reductions in logging to protect the threatened spotted owl would turn the Northwest into Appalachia. Owls hung in effigy in Timbertown taverns. President Bush predicted every Northwest mill worker would lose his job.
It is time to make people more important than owls.
But the Oregon economy today has never looked better. Though the state has lost 15,000 jobs in the forest products industry in the last 5 years, its economy has generated 100,000 other jobs in the last year alone. The unemployment rate is at its lowest since the 1960s, about 5%. That's lower than most states in the country.
And about fewer logs being exported.
Conservationists say Oregon is proving that environmental protection doesn't have to mean economic calamity.
All that was talked about was the economics of cutting down trees. There wasn't a discussion about the economics of those jobs and industries that are dependent upon trees remaining standing. Jobs in the commercial and sport fishing industries, the tourism and recreation industries, and indirectly damn near every other industry in the state who can attract quality workers because the environment is nice.
High-tech, high-paying manufacturing plants are springing up only miles from shut-down forests. A large Sony plant is rising in Springfield, a depressed timber town with several closed mills. It will manufacture compact discs and may employ 1,500 people. Sony says Oregon's pristine environment helped lure it there.
Quality of life issues, outdoor sports, the ability for bicycling, fishing, swimming, skiing, winter skiing, and also water skiing. Those issues are important. We're a company, we work hard, we need to play hard.
It's the same story in Corvallis, where 4,500 employees are helping Hewlett-Packard meet exploding consumer demand for laser printers and laptop computers. High-tech will surpass timber as the state's leading source of jobs sometime this year for the first time.
That group of industries as a whole has added about 7,000 jobs since 1989. That's a significant number of high-wage jobs being created in the Oregon state economy.
The timber industry itself has saved some jobs by modernizing. Many Northwest sawmills shut down when the federal government placed old-growth forests off limits to loggers, thus reducing the supply of big trees. But this mill retooled. It can now make wood veneer from smaller, younger trees.
In the 60s and 70s, we used to use 5-6 foot diameter logs to peel, and now we're peeling logs that are so doggone small they used to be considered only good for, you know, let's say a stud mill.
It seems a promising picture for Oregon, but the timber industry says the Beaver State still has rocky times ahead. It says retooled mills and high-tech jobs will only delay, not avert, a regional economic crisis.
We haven't hit the wall yet on job losses and economic impacts to these communities.
Industry spokesman Chris West says the state's timber supply, and in turn its sawmill employment, have been artificially inflated for the last 2 years. But that's about to end.
We're not going to have the logs to run as many mills as we have in Oregon and Washington. And so people are going to lose their jobs.
West cites 2 reasons. First, greater foreign demand for raw, unfinished logs will lead to more exports and take work away from local sawmills. Second, a recent burst of over-harvesting by private timber growers will eventually deplete log supplies. West says up to 100,000 timber jobs will be lost region-wide. And economists note that while thousands of new jobs are being created in Oregon, most are being filled by highly educated college graduates or highly trained professionals moving to Oregon. Oregon's displaced timber workers often are left on the sidelines.
These people just don't have what it takes. If Intel's developing new plants in the Portland metropolitan area, they're requiring assembly workers with certain specific skills, one of which is undoubtedly not chainsaw manipulation.
As far as working electronic assembly line, I just don't think I could do that. My hands are kind of beat up as it is, and I don't think that kind of work would be for me.
Russ Sieber has been unable to get on the new economy's fast track. His rural town of Sweet Home, once home to 6 mills, now has only 2. He was laid off after 27 years in a mill.
I have good manual dexterity, but my finger dexterity, I'm almost 50 years old, and it's just not like it used to be.
Sieber has been brushing up on his math skills, but fears he's unprepared for Oregon's new economy.
I was always weak in math. I never was really good at it. I'm lost. I really don't know. I'm doing everything that I've been trained to do. I try my best, but trying to get a job is, you know, there's only so much you can do.
Timber is what made Oregon what it is today. There should always be a place for timber in Oregon, and we're being pushed out.
Some Sweet Home timber workers say they already have the technical training to transition to the new economy, but they simply don't want to. Brian Cornell is a college-educated forest engineer.
We are high-tech. I run a machine that's fully computerized. These mills are fully computerized. Laser sensors, 5 men can run this sawmill. That's high-tech. We use it too, and I just don't think I should have to retrain.
Dozens of Oregon timber towns have become pockets of poverty as timber workers struggle to adjust. In December, Sweet Home firefighters collected Christmas gifts for hundreds of neighbors unable to afford any.
You could just place it somewhere in here would be fine.
Something there for everybody.
Great. Well, I'm sure the kids will be very appreciative of it.
Oh, you bet.
Our Christmas kind of had a bad turn, so we're striving to get by as best we can.
Did you try building this without this right here?
Thousands of timber workers do seem ready to change. 2,300 have enrolled in the nation's largest center for retraining woodworkers at Lane Community College in Springfield. Eldon Hilfiker, laid off after 13 years in sawmills, figures his future is in electronics.
You make the best of the situation you're in. You know, sitting on the couch saying, well, to hell with it, isn't going to get a person anywhere.
70% of the retrainees have landed new jobs, most in a field related to their retraining. Success rates are even higher, about 90%, when timber workers receive unemployment benefits in tandem with the schooling. Program Administrator Ellen Palmer says extending benefits to all retrainees will ease the state's transition to a new economy.
They need to have monies available to help
support them while they're in training. Those are important pieces if we really are looking at retraining a workforce.
For now, though, Oregonians are going to have to make do with what they've got. Those who've made the change, like Mike McNeil, seem to know that while they can hang on to the clothing and memories of their past, there may be no choice but to embrace some part of Oregon's decidedly different future.
Again, the major story of this Thursday is the earthquake in Japan. More than 4,000 people have been killed, nearly 22,000 injured from Tuesday's quake. A new outbreak of fires is hampering efforts to find the 700 people still missing. Nearly 300,000 are living in temporary shelters. Much of the city of Kobe is without power and light and water. Good night, Elizabeth.
Good night, Jim. That's it for the News Hour. We'll see you tomorrow night. I'm Elizabeth Farnsworth. Good night.
Funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour has been provided by the Archer Daniels Midland Company. With ADM ingredients in thousands of consumer products, it's no wonder ADM is called Supermarket to the World. And by New York Life, yet another example of the wise investment philosophy New York Life has been following for the last 150 years. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
Video cassettes of the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1.
This is PBS.
The MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour is brought to you locally by SIT Mutual Fund Group, pure no-load mutual funds managed by Twin Cities-based SIT Investment Associates. Lyman Lumber Company, the professional builders supply center, serving the Twin Cities from Chanhassen. The law firm of Gray, Plant, Moody & Bennett, a professional association where results are a tradition. And by Little Six Incorporated, proudly owned and operated by the Shakopee Mdewakanton Dakota community.
Get the real story on the future of public television. Will Channel 2 be unplugged? Find out next.
I'm Jack Willis, president of Twin Cities Public Television, with an urgent message. Public broadcasting is fighting for its life. There are those in Congress who would stop all federal funding for public broadcasting. This means 3 of Minnesota's 5 public stations would go off the air, and KTCA would cut back its national schedule and seriously curtail its local programming. Just imagine, no almanac, no news night, no lost Twin Cities, no tapes rolling. If you care about public broadcasting, please write. Let them know how you feel. Your opinion will make all the difference, and there's no time to waste.
For more information on your congressman and where to write, please call 229-3026.